This is an interview with Jim Knowles for the Oral History Project of the Eastham Historical Society, and it's taking place in Jim's childhood home on Corliss Road in Eastham. The date is November 2nd, 2023, and the interviewers are Rick Lindholm and myself, Marca Daley. Rick.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We talked a little about you getting into MIT last time, and we didn't talk at all about what you majored in.
Okay.
I guess we could start there.
Sure. Well, first of all, getting into MIT, I guess throughout my high school career, I was good at math and science. People said, you're going to be an engineer. So I just went along with it. And at some point, Mon Cochran, who was our guidance director, came up and suggested a series of schools that I should apply to. And they were all engineering, RPI, Worcester Polytech, MIT, and I think maybe even Tufts was involved. So things went on, didn't pay much attention. And then one day he burst into my English class, came in the back door, said, Jim, yep, got to see you. He found I'd been accepted at MIT. And he was more excited than I was,
Okay.
but because that was an achievement for him in terms of getting me there, and I give him full credit for getting into MIT. Now, going to MIT was an experience. I went up and visited once with my parents to see the campus, which was simply a whole lot of buildings with long corridors you could walk through. But I got dropped off in September, went in, entered a fraternity. In those days you did right away if you found someone. And I lived on Beacon Street for the next 4 years, 530 Beacon Street. What I know is that a whole lot of kids were smart. Everybody was a valedictorian in there, in MIT. And today, if you look at the numbers, this year they had 30,000 applications. The school said they could have accepted 27,000 of them, and they would have all done well. But the 1,000 is all they take in the class. So the odds are pretty slim, no matter who you are. Well, a couple things happened at MIT. The first year you don't declare a major. You simply take the normal science, math courses. And the second year they expected you to start making a decision. Well, that time I determined that I didn't want to go to school forever. And I probably wanted to be in engineering, but not an engineer for the rest of my life, so I wanted management. And of course, people think, well, you get your engineering degree, then you go back and get an MBA. But I said, I don't want to do that. I want to get out and go to work. So I signed up for what's course 15. Now, if you go to MIT, you never name the course, you always have a number. But course 15 is industrial management. And then course 2, mechanical engineering, was my minor. So I was taking thermodynamics and accounting and structural disciplines and marketing, so a whole combination of things. So that was a major decision in what I was going to do in life. Other than that, a couple things happened at MIT you might be interested in. 1961 was the 100th anniversary of MIT. And it was a big year. They had lots of celebrations. We had, parties. One thing they did was they hired a train to go from the buildings out to Sturbridge Village. Each fraternity got a car that we could decorate, and we went out to the village, and then we had Pete Seeger was sitting on the green singing at one place and another. So it was quite an occasion. The next occasion, I was taking labor law as one of my courses, and the professor also taught a grad school course in labor law. The Teamsters Union was in town, and the professor had made contact and arranged to have Jimmy Hoffa come over and give interviews to the students. So the undergrads were invited to attend, and it was carefully screened to make sure you were a student and not a reporter. But we went in at 7 o'clock into a big classroom. Jim came in with a couple of his henchmen, you'd call them these days, but they simply sat quietly in the corner. And he jumped up on top of a desk. And for the next 4 hours, he took questions and answers to anything we asked. And
Wow.
it was an amazing display of his grasp of the business, of the situation. And as a management student, that's what I came out of there with. As it approached midnight, he said, "We've got to cut this off. I have negotiations starting at 7 in the morning, but if the grad students would like to come back and join me at breakfast at 6, we can continue there."
Wow.
So
That's
that was,
That's something, that's what a story.
yeah, it was quite a thing.
Yeah.
And our professor said that when he made contact with Hoffa, for the next 4 weeks, cars followed him around every place he went. And in those days, it was Bobby Kennedy trying to catch Hoffa doing something, so they followed the professor. Well, senior year comes along, have interviews. One of my professors apparently suggested to the interviewer that they contact me. So I was contacted by the New England Telephone Company, part of the Bell system. Interviewed there and accepted a job. Graduated late in May, 1st of June. Flat broke. I came home for a month, worked here to get enough money so when I went back down to New Haven to begin work, I could rent a house or rent an apartment at least and pay for my meals until I got my first paycheck.
What year was
And
this,
this
Jim?
was in 1962.
Okay.
I began working for the telephone company on July 2nd that year. My father thought it was just awful that I got a paid holiday 2 days after working there. But when I went to work, I was an assistant engineer and basically doing studies for the outside plant. In other words, the cables that connected central offices, not the ones that connect to your home, but the ones that went from town to give you the connection when you made a call. I did a wire center study, it was called. They wanted to put in a new office. Well, they wanted to put in sort of like the center of gravity, so all the houses are equally spread around. Only it's not quite that simple because houses further out require more expensive wiring, so you have to figure all that in, and that's what I ended up doing for a year. But in November of '63, the draft laws changed, and they stopped drafting married men. So I called up and said, I want to check on my status, and I called, this was to Hyannis. They said, we mailed out your draft notice yesterday. I got up, told my boss I had to leave, and I went down to the local Army Reserve and signed up there for the Army Reserve. Told them the situation. They said, well, when you get your draft notice, don't open it, just bring it in and we'll send it back and tell them you're enlisted. So I did that, and then a few months later, in February, I went off to go to boot camp down in Columbia, South Carolina, Fort Jackson. Did my 3 months there, came home, and then had to go back for 3 months of duty. And I did that down in Virginia, right below, right over by Newport News, at Fort Earl. It was very simple duty. We ran a railroad. It was in a railroad battalion because the reserve unit in New Haven was sponsored by the New Haven Railroad. But I was an engineer. The company was paying supposedly the difference in pay, but they actually the company continued to pay me my full pay while I was in the service. So I was the most highly paid guy in the unit, including my captain in those days. And I was driving a Porsche. So anytime I wanted to go someplace, I drove off the base, came back. They always saluted me at the gate. I came through. I never knew I had to have a pass for the first 2 months I was there. I got back from the service, went back to the phone company, and they announced they put me into an engineer program that they had at IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, in South Chicago. And that I would go every other month for a year. There were 2 of us selected, and we would alternate months. So for the next year, every other month, I went to Chicago, went to the school. I can't claim I learned a lot there because I'd learned most of it already was at MIT, but it was a great time. The neighborhood wasn't great. You often heard shots at night, but we stayed there pretty comfortable. When I went back to work, they then transferred me to another unit. I got promoted to engineer from assistant engineer, and I was now in charge of a group that was doing programming. I had done programming when I was at MIT on very early computers that were very big computers with very little power. And now the Bell system was starting to say, what should we be doing? Everybody thought accounting was the only thing they could do. But all of the inventory control and other things were needed were to be done. Ultimately, they established a unit down in New Jersey to do this, to develop programs to be used throughout the Bell system. I was transferred down and became a supervisor in one of the units there, doing essentially building an inventory control program for all of the, it's called plug-in equipment that are in central offices. Now the units that they use when they set up a circuit from one place to another require a lot of electronics. So that central office you see in Orleans, the brick building today, has a whole lot of shelves, if you will, and you plug in the equipment as you need it. Well, that equipment's expensive, and so keeping track of what you had where and what was being used was part of our job.
Wow.
So we developed that software and then had to go out and install it in 17 companies, across the US. So that involved some travel.
How many companies in the US?
Well, there were 17
That's
units
cool.
of the system. I mean, you have your New York Tel, New England Tel in those days, Northwest Bell, California Tel. So it was all broken up into the different units, and each one had its own separate billing system. About 3 years later, we updated the software, and we had to go out and do a conversion. That involved me sending a team out, go out on a Friday, so we might have to fly out on Thursday if we go on the West Coast. On Friday night, at the end of business, we would go in and take down their system, dump all the records, and install our new system.
Wow.
By Monday morning, it was up and running. We would do it for one weekend, leave it there so that they could train on the system for 2 weeks and make any adjustments they might need to do, because each company had its own theories about how they wanted things to run. And then we'd go out and do it again for real on the next second weekend. So this involved taking a team of almost 10 people, putting them on planes, sending them out, being there for 3 days, 4 days, coming back, and then repeating the process. Eat twice for each company, so 34 times, 34 weekends over a 2-year period we spent traveling around the country.
Wow.
I had some very young people that had gone to community colleges at a 2-year degree. They had never been out of New Jersey, and I tell them they needed to get on a plane and be in Salem, Oregon, Friday morning, and then be coming home on Monday morning. So I had to make sure I had somebody with them, just they weren't old enough to rent a car, so they couldn't get to where they needed to be going, and arrange to get them out for meals and other things. So it was kind of interesting, but everybody that was on the project enjoyed it. When I think back now, asking people to work weekends much and traveling around the country, I don't know what response would be, but these people actually loved it and talked about it for years. That was a real bonding effect.
And when was this?
And this was all through the 70s.
Wow, okay.
Late in 79, I guess someplace I'd been appointed to department head, so I had several groups working for me at that point. In 79, I was transferred down to another unit where we were going to build software that basically predated the internet, but tried to do the same things that were done on the internet. And this is a very large project being done for some people that believed in it at headquarters at AT&T. So we went down and did it. I had 700 people working for me at one point. Of those, there were probably 50 PhDs, 500 masters, and other assistants. And honestly, the project failed. We spent $1 billion, but it wasn't a success
Why was
because the
that?
technology changed, some other internet things happened, and therefore it wouldn't go out. But in the process of doing that, had to give talks. We attended the, I forget what it was called, it was the International Computer Communications Conference. The first one I went to was in Sydney, Australia. So I had to go down there, and I was able to spend a few days in Tahiti on the way down, and a few days in New Zealand on the way back. But gave the talk. The talk was at the Opera House.
Oh,
Bay
wow.
down there. That's where all our meetings were. So that was quite an experience. 2 years later, the same conference was held in London. So I gave a talk there. The opening ceremony was the Duke of Kent did the introductions. I had an audience of maybe 2,000 people I had to give a speech to. And I wasn't great on stage presence in terms of talking, but we got through it. The thing I remember about that one was the meal that we had, the dinner. They sponsored a big dinner for 2,000 people at the Guildhall, which is a hall built in the center of Old London back in 1400 and something. It was formal dress. We all had, I don't know if it was sherry in the waiting room, anteroom, before we all marched into the tables. We had the Queen's Coldstream Guards playing the dinner music and going through things. And all I remember at that time was you couldn't do something until the toast to the Queen was given. You couldn't have a cigarette or do other things until the toast was given and then sit down. But that was a memorable experience, going through all of that, those two talks. So as we moved on, that project came to an end, and I moved into UNIX, which is an operating system developed by the Bell system that ran all many computers and things all ran Unix for the most part. There was a big battle among those companies that wanted to keep their own operating system, and companies bound together. We had those called UNIX International, which are probably a dozen or more computer companies that got together, and we were in that. And so we had meetings around the world. I went to Japan to give a talk. The translator wanted a copy of my talk, and I said, I don't have a copy, I just have slides that I will speak as I come to each one. And so I got the big, oh, which is, you know, the typical reaction to that. And off we went. I'm going through, and later I learned I did something, and she told her, at this point you should all laugh. And they all laughed, and on we went through it. I went back, we had an office also in Tokyo, a Unix office. And I had to go back to that several times during that job to meet with customers or talk with things.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very interesting there. I also had to give a talk in Stockholm. I had to visit with the Nobel Prize board of the technical people. It was arranged that I would come over and give them a talk. The person that ran our office in Stockholm was an ex-astronaut. He had worked at Bell Labs, was in the Air Force Reserve, and been an astronaut. He had never been to Europe, but he had been around it 23 times. The day I was there, he had pictures in his office of the satellite they put up taken through the porthole of the cabin he was in. The day I was there, they were up replacing the equipment in that satellite. So that made quite
Wow.
a notable event. So UNIX was a big thing. We had lots of partnerships with different companies doing things. We had one thing going on with Olivetti, which caused me to go to Ivrea, which is about 90 miles north of Milan, to visit with them at their factory and talk about what they were doing there. Very interesting places. I had to go, also as mentioned, to England, down to what was their Silicon Valley area. Several companies there were involved, so talking there. We used to get together with UNIX International and meet, and they would pick different places. So I've been to Luxembourg, was one of the places they chose to have a meeting, which not many people have been to.
Yeah.
But I've given talks in Italy, which again was a translation talk, people do, and then gave the same talk the next day in London. So did quite a bit of traveling in the course of the UNIX. And when I gave a talk in Korea, I had to go there, and I was introduced as the grandfather of UNIX. I don't know what that, but that's how it came out in the translation. I was later told. Hopefully I wasn't that old and hadn't invented it. So UNIX was a big thing. Coming out of UNIX, AT&T offered an early retirement program in 1989. I took that program, and the next day started work for Salomon Brothers on Wall Street. So a job over there. This was the point where Wall Street was just going from analog, green screens with graphs, to digital. So you can things up, and you now used a mouse and other things to examine stock prices as they were happening, or different programs that were going on. I had groups that built software that if you wanted to invest $15 million in a certain fund that was a mixture of stocks, this thing would take over and it would buy the appropriate amount of each stock, but not do it all at once, do it in tranches, they called them, so you didn't affect the price that much. So that was one of the interesting things we're doing. We had a trading floor. We moved into number 5 World Tower. It was one of the buildings that was knocked down when number 1 fell. But we were up on the 41st and 42nd floor. We had taken out the center of the floor so that we could have a 2-story trading room. The person in charge at that time was a guy named Goodfriend, who was notorious on Wall Street. And he had someone working for him who got in serious trouble in the bond market by taking over the bonds and caused a big setback in the company. So big things were going on.
Wow.
After 2 years there's a revolution of management. Anybody that was brought in by the old was gone. I was gone. And I went to work, ended up being a small consulting company that was then absorbed by Coopers and Lybrand. And I was working out of New Jersey. So at Coopers and Lybrand, I was basically a consultant, an IT consultant, a senior consultant. I would go to companies and explain if they wanted to do a big project, what the likelihoods would be that they succeed, or what the difficulties would be in getting there, since most large projects have a record of failure. You have to expect some failure, but you have to figure out how to make it work smoothly.
Right.
Along the way. That led me to some work. I did a lot of work at that time going to Silicon Valley and talking to small companies, startups, to see if they had something that would be of value or synergistic to work with us in consulting. A new language, new way of doing things. So that kept me busy. But also, I had 2 assignments. One was in, I guess, Korea. I guess I had 2 in Korea. Samsung wanted to build cars. They wanted to go into car business. The way they proposed to do it was basically to take a Japanese car and manufacturing plant, reproduce that, and then gradually make the changes to make it their model rather than the Japanese. But they wanted an accounting system that would meet their needs. Essentially meant they wanted to give 2 different answers, one for the government and one for their use. And that's what they were trying to do. And I was trying to convince them that they should use a commercial software system because it took hundreds of man hours to build that, maybe even thousands. So it would be several years before they could actually get there and get it working right. I'm not sure it succeeded. Other things I did there, I also had an assignment in Australia to go down to the equivalent of the Social Security Department in the US. So they had one department and they had a program that they were doing all the servicing with. And it used unique software. And it worked, but they kept needing to be at the top end of the biggest machine they could buy from IBM. And they were using software that nobody else used. So if somebody in their apartment got hit by a bus, they couldn't replace them with an experienced person. So I tried to explain the risk they were taking. And one of the things we got into was, I called it the steamship phenomena. All the great improvements in sailing ships were made after the invention of the steamship, because the competition of the steamship caused them to think, how do I make the sailboat faster, bigger, all the things you needed to do. I said the same thing was happening with them. They had a group of people that would keep making tweaks and twitches to the software so that it would fit and go. But at some point, there's no way to replace it.
Right.
So I did spend a couple of weeks there, down in Canberra, and Canberra's their capital. It's very small, it's sort of a circular city the way it's built. I took a drive one day outside the city, and I found an observatory, and they were giving lectures. I went in, sat down, and it was first when the first telescope, not the Webb, I want to say Harold, but it's not Harold, wrong word.
Hubble.
The Hubble.
There you go.
And they had shots that showed what we thought before were stars were now galaxies.
Oh, wow.
So that it just amazed me. And now we put the Webb up, and the same thing has happened. They found that there are galaxies. So there are so many millions and billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars, that you start taking that number and say, we're one of something with about a whole lot of zeros after it. How unique can we be, right? That was an interesting part of that trip. And that meant driving around the city where the kangaroos were running around like rabbits.
Yeah.
And you'd see if your kangaroo was on the side of the road, if you saw a red X on it, that means somebody had examined it and there was no baby in the womb. So there was no rush to collect the body.
Oh, wow.
So that was I ended up at PwC. And we having merged with Coopers and Lybrand, and then Coopers and Lybrand merged with Price Waterhouse Coopers. Yeah. That was our final thing. In all of this, I did quite a bit of travel. I accumulated nearly 2 million miles on those years. I mean, one year I did more than 25 trips from New York to San Francisco, because we had joint projects going on, so every 2 weeks you're doing project reviews and trying to manage that. I had some people in Denver, people down in DC, so just keeping track of folks meant a lot of travel a lot of talking. Now,
I keep thinking, the young boy who had the paper route on Route 6 in Eastham.
Yep,
Yeah.
I got more miles now. Now, I laughed at something earlier. At Salomon Brothers, we had trading floors in London and in Tokyo, as well as New York. And we had a teleconferencing system. I used to have meetings at 7 in the morning because it would be noontime in London and 7 o'clock at night in Tokyo. So I'd have all three groups on talking about things.
Right.
The cameras were sound activated. So the major camera would flash on with those that were speaking. Well, we had the problem with the Japanese. They would never interrupt. So the camera never got in. And when they would always nod, and that didn't mean they agreed, it simply means, I hear you, I hear you. And so you had to have more discussion to find out whether they really heard you, believed you, or what was going on.
Or agreed.
And so that was interesting, managing the different cultures
Yes.
as you went across, because the New York culture, Salomon Brothers, was an extreme stretch from AT&T in terms of probably abuse, power hungry. I mean, the average salary, what's the average? They paid people a $150,000 salary, and everything else was bonuses. And some guy would be complaining because he only got $3 million this year and not the $4 that he expected. So the money was all over the place for everything. So they're
Wow.
making it big, even if they're not successful.
Right.
So that was an experience. Now along the way, I met some interesting people. I've already mentioned Jimmy Hoffa being one that impressed me.
Right.
Did a lot of work with Sun Microsystems. So Scott McNealy was the CEO, but he was a young man in his, in his 30s or something at that time. Scott McNealy, and he had Bill Joy was his chief technical architect, and he was a nerd, and it'd be the best description of him, far out. And then the third one there would be Eric Schmidt. He ran the group in which my group was working with, so I got to see him a few times. He wasn't a founder, but he was a one of the first 10 people on board at Sun. Today, Joy and McNealy are worth $1 billion. Schmidt went on and ended up being CEO for Google. He's worth $19 billion. Did some work at Microsoft also. We partnered on merging some of their software. Did get to meet Steve Ballmer. Spent a night snowed in down in Washington. We were at a convention when all the planes were canceled, nobody could leave, and so big party at the hotel, and Steve was at the center of that in his boisterous, loud manner, as he's always there. And of course, he's worth $103 billion at this point. So the numbers are just astronomical. Right. I remember going to a restaurant, the Giraffe in New Jersey, with Bill Joy. He walked in, no jacket. He said, "Sir, jacket's required." He went back out the car, got his leather jacket, brought it in, walked in, took it off, put it in the back of the chair, and we continued the meal. So that's what that was. At AT&T, when I was working on UNIX, or maybe on the EHS project, the larger project, I used to meet periodically at meetings with Arno Penzias. Arno's a Nobel Prize winner. He and Wilson were studying the universe. They're physicists, and they had this big cone-shaped microphone, let's call it, down in Holmdel, where we were stationed at that time. And they kept getting this noise they couldn't get rid of. So they thought maybe it was pigeon droppings. They went in, they cleaned the whole inside of this thing out, and they still got it. Well, it turns out it was the residual noise from the Big Bang, they finally determined. And that's what he got his Nobel Prize for, so I worked with him. When I was in another project, they sent me to a school out in Berkeley. It was a senior management school. And it was with people from all around the world. We had Finland, France, Korea, Japan, Australia, maybe 18 people. And I spent 3 months there. And we had lectures. I remember one was a Nobel Prize winner, I don't remember his name at the point. Go away. We talked about risk. How do you manage risk in a company? And we talked about the example of an airport. They wanted to put a new airport in New York. And there was things, we don't want to put it close to the city because in case of an accident, too many people could be killed. So they proposed moving up towards Stewart and putting it up there. He said, but when they examined the risk that people will spend on the highway going there, more people will be killed on the highway than would be killed in a plane crash. So that's, you have to measure those things and think past the first obvious thing, as you do today when you're talking about climate warming, climate change. Think past it, think about the electric vehicles. I always talk about what the car does, but there's a whole lot of other things that go with it that have to be thought about when you're talking about that. So I've continued traveling. As you say, I was married back in 1965, but divorced after 43 years. I came back to the Cape when my father was in his house back. Came back to visit in 2002, and I sent a note off to my girlfriend from high school. When I was here visiting my father, my aunt came in, gave me a big hug, and she whispered in my ear, "Judy's separated." I said, okay. Well, it turns out Judy was Judy Johnson, Judy Cronin, and I called her up and said, I'm coming back down, you want to get together and have lunch? She said, well, we better make it dinner. And it turns out, now we've been married and living together now for the last 15 years. We've traveled, we've been to more than 30 countries in the last few years, traveling.
Wow.
From around Cape Horn up to Norway, out to Greece. This last year over to Japan. I have to tell you the changes in Japan. I've been to many of these countries, but I go in, I go to a hotel, I go to a meeting room, I go to the airport, and I'm gone. I've only done one trip to Japan and I've done probably 6 or 7, in which I actually got out of the city, went down to Kamakura and saw a little bit of it. But this time I got to go around and see the whole country when we were there. It was the whole southern island, not the northern island, where all the skiing is, but did that. So we want to continue traveling till I can't. I had a daughter that we adopted in 1976. She was Korean, 1 year old, we got her. Turned out, you sort of flipping a coin, you know what you're going to get. She was the easiest kid to raise, in my opinion. She was interested in everything, a quick learner. In first grade, she was reading to the class. So she already knew books. We had a place in Florida, we went there to get took her in to get a library card. And she came back with a stack of books in the library and said, oh, you can't take that many out it's your first time. So she took half the number, and I took her back the next day. She had read all 5 books that night. And they said, you can take as many as you want after that. So she went through the schools in Tewksbury, the grammar school, and Voorhees High School, which is our regional high school there. Mm-hmm. She was valedictorian of the some odd people in that class. I say, went on, got accepted at Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. Got her undergraduate degree at MIT. Then went to Cal Davis and got her master's there. Met her current husband, who's in computer science. And he's a professor at Cal Poly.
Wow.
And she now works for Amazon. Her first job, she worked for a small company making telephone equipment for cell sites and the software that runs them. And they had to go to Korea for potential customers. She went twice. Of course, when she arrives at customs, they speak to her in Korean. She doesn't understand a word. And she goes in and gets through. And it turns out once they find out that she's Korean, adopted, went to MIT, they want to teach her everything about the country. So she had great visits there. When I gave a talk there in Korea, the first thing, when I was introduced as having a daughter that went from MIT that was Korean. And they were...
That's your
That was it,
introduction.
I was just hanging along. She was
Right.
she was the one. So that made a big impression on things. She's continuing on. She's been very active in STEM, which is the science for basically getting women into the science program is what they're interested in. And she was doing that when she was at MIT. She was giving lectures. She's done it since, and it's now an official thing that she does within Amazon. And of course, she just came back from the Grace Hopper conference, which Grace Hopper was a mathematician, computer scientist for the Navy, who stayed in the Navy until she was 80 some odd years old, I think. It was a famous record for women in science. So that's sort of a
Wow.
brief on what I've done for the years.
This has been really wonderful. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
For a little guy from the Cape,
A little guy from the Cape. Yeah.
yeah, who knows what's going to happen?
Who knows?
And most things happen because of luck, not good planning.
Yeah.
Just
Wow.
incidents.
Amazing.
Well, I'll end this with some advice my grandmother said to me. And she said, Marca, opportunity only knocks once.
Yep.
And if you're smart, you're going to go to the door and see who's there. And I have a feeling that that's just what you did when these opportunities came for you, Jim. You took a look and saw who was there and then went with it.
Just, something will happen along the way. I mean, when I first went down to AT&T, they found space for us in the center of Newark on the second floor of an old apartment building. Well, 3 months later, they had the riots, and coming into town, everything was burnt and torn down. And so we got out of there within a year.
Wow.
And moved on to a motel, which we took over.
This has been fascinating. Thank you so much.
All right.
It's,
You're welcome.
It's not the Eastham part of the history, but it's fascinating where that has led you.
Yeah. I mean, you think back, people from here, McMillan, down in Provincetown. I mean, I remember him from a kid giving a lecture at the town hall. Well, I couldn't have been 6, 7 years old. But there's a guy that went off and spent years at the North Pole doing investigations.
I remember him in the museum. He used to stand
Yeah.
right at the beginning of that museum. I was a little kid
Yeah.
looking up at him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
This is the end of the recording.